My name's Sarah, and today we're going to be talking about impacts of sea ice loss on polar bear distribution. So to start off, I thought it'd be beneficial to just go over a little overview about what the presentation is going to consist of. So I'm going to start off talking about the introduction to our topic, how our topic connects to biogeography, the polar bear distribution and how that has shifted in the Arctic, as well as the habitat fragmentation that has occurred because of the Arctic warming, and then a little case study that I found on the Western Hudson Bay area. And then Quinn will be talking about behavioral changes, adaptation to warmer climate, survival impact for individuals, survival impact for population, human-wildlife conflict, and genetic diversity and gene flow. So to start off, polar bears are found all over the Arctic region, in Canada, Alaska, Russia, Greenland, and Norway. This is known as circumpolar Arctic distribution, which means that they are found all over Arctic regions rather than just in one specific area. In these areas, polar bears are considered to be an indicator species. In a paper I read, they explain that this is because polar bears encompass a vast area of diverse habitats. So changes in its life cycle and population declines are often seen to reflect environmental change simulated by shifts in global climate in the Arctic. I thought it was important to note that polar bears depend on sea ice for a number of survival tasks, such as breeding, hunting, and traveling. As we know, the Arctic is warming quickly, which is causing a major loss of sea ice. The loss of this sea ice is then leading to a change in the polar bear distribution. So how is this relevant to biogeography? Well, biogeography studies where species live over time and why. Here, we are looking at the distribution of polar bears, which is being shaped by climate. This is affecting their habitat, food, and increasing travel barriers. In relation to biogeography, polar bears can be seen as a strong example of climate-driven range shifts. And when we look at the distribution change of polar bears, it also may help us understand ecosystem response and environmental change. When it comes to how much of the sea ice is actually being lost or declining, I found a study which included this graph. It shows the significant decline over the last 50 years. This paper also talked about how over the last 50 years we can see sea ice forming later in the year and then melting earlier, in total reducing the total time during the year that the polar bears can spend on the ice. So in the graph we can see from 1975 to 2025 that there is quite a rapid decline, with the lowest points being in about 2010 to 2015 area. I would say that's about 2012, give or take. So the Arctic reaches its maximum extent of sea ice in March and minimum extent in April. The measurement of sea ice is defined as the total number of surface area of all the grid cells that have a sea ice concentration of at least 15%. So they kind of divide up the area they're looking at into grid cells, which you can see in the image on the right. And then they take those grid cells and count which ones of them have 15% or more of sea ice. The study also found that in September of 2024, the area was 2.03 million square kilometers smaller than in 1981 and 2010. So from 1981 to 2010. Which is quite a crazy amount of sea ice loss. So now that we know a little bit more about how much the sea ice is actually declining in the Arctic, we can take a look at the distribution shift on polar bears in the last decade or so. From many studies that I have read, they all point to polar bears gradually moving more north, which is likely because the sea ice will last longer up there as it is maybe colder or just different geography. I also wanted to note that the southern polar bear populations in the lower Hudson Bay region are also experiencing periods of time with there's no ice at all, which is forcing polar bears inwards and on land for longer periods of time. So this was an interesting graph in a study done by Steve DeRouche, who was able to kind of map the changes in the fall, spring, and summer of the polar bear shift, or what I like to call refinement. In the 2000s, which is in green, we can compare the distribution to the purple, which is the 1990s. We also see large gaps that develop in the 2000s, which the author referred to as maybe evidence of habitat fragmentation. So we can see, mostly in the summer graph is what I noticed, we can see that on the left of the summer side, there is a big section And then on the top right, we can see that there are these little circles that the right side isn't, or the left side isn't connected to. I'm not sure if I can zoom in. I'm not sure if this works and you guys can see it, but that's kind of what I'm talking about, the gap there. Yeah, the graph is a little bit blurry, but I think it does a trick there. So habitat fragmentation happens or is caused by sea ice melting, which then creates a barrier as to where the polar bears can move. This leaves the polar bear to either increase home range size to compensate for the declines in the resources, or reduce their home range size and switch to alternative resources. The effects of habitat fragmentation are significant, as it disrupts the polar bear's natural movement, mating, and hunting patterns. As we know, habitat fragmentation can also lead to reduced gene flow and an increased risk of local extinction. Alright, so now for the case study that I wanted to talk about. It's titled Changes in Polar Bear Distribution in the Western Hudson Bay area, or in the Western Hudson Bay. It was published in 2010. They used methods of long-term monitoring, satellite data tracking, and comparison of historical versus recent polar bear distribution patterns. They found that over the last 30 years, sea ice has been breaking up earlier and forming later, which I noted earlier. Obviously, this reduces the amount of time polar bears can hunt. As a result, polar bears are spending more time on land and their distribution is shifting northward where sea ice lasts longer. They also found a significant correlation between ice breakup and the shift in polar bear distribution. Interestingly enough, they also found that there was a lower proportion of adult male polar bears in recent years. The map shows the differences between the polar bear distributions on the right there, where graph A is showing 1986 to 1996, and map B is showing from 1997 to 2004. We can see that the area where the polar bears are has kind of... So the area where the polar bears are, I guess it doesn't really show, is that darker area, and we can see that it has shifted kind of upwards there. This study is important because it provides clear evidence that climate change is directly altering polar bear distribution, especially in regions like the Hudson's Bay.